Hello.
Hello.
Hi there, Suzanne. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're just waiting for our subcommittee members, and then we can go ahead and start.
All right.
Good afternoon, Mayor Rogers.
Howdy.
Looks like we are still waiting for Vice Mayor Rogers and Councilmember Alvarez.
We'll give one more minute here. I know the Vice Mayor had a packed schedule.
Sounds good. It looks like I see Councilmember Alvarez. Good afternoon, Councilmember Alvarez.
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing?
Doing good. Thank you. How are you?
Are you able to hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Let's go ahead and take the roll and go ahead and get started today.
Councilmember Alvarez,
Present.
Vice Mayor Rogers,
Present.
Mayor Rogers.
Here.
Let the record show all council members are present.
Great. First of all, thank you everybody for being here. Council members, do we have any announcements before we get started? Anything from you, Amy?
None for me, thank you.
Great. We'll go ahead and go on then to approval of the minutes. We have none here today. So we'll start with public comments for non-agenda items. If you're interested in giving a comment today for items that are not on our current agenda, go ahead and hit the raise hand feature on Zoom. We'll go ahead and start with Woody and then go to Kevin.
Just one moment. Sorry, my computer's being a little slow this afternoon. Woody, I have enabled your speaking permissions. If you can please unmute yourself.
Great, thanks so much. Can you
Do you
hear
see
me?
the timer on your screen?
I do.
Perfect. Please identify yourself for public record if you so choose, and your time begins now.
Sure, it's Woody Hastings, and I live in unincorporated Sonoma County, and I just want to make it clear that I'm just speaking today for myself, not on behalf of any organization. And I just want to say that, there's this Earth Day event tomorrow, and it's a drive up Earth Day event. And I know that members of this committee had made efforts to try to adjust that idea, that event, so that it could at least, accommodate walk-ups and bicyclists and whatnot, and that the city, the timer doesn't seem to be moving, but I won't take 3 minutes. I just wanted to say that, it's just kind of unfortunate that the city is hosting an event where for Earth Day that people are asked to drive up in an automobile, and I understand the need to distribute the water saving kits and all that, and that's good, but it seems like there might be other ways to get that out without a drive up event. And so just wanted to just make a note that to really try to avoid that kind of thing where the event itself contradicts the fundamental purpose of the purpose and meaning of the event in itself. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks so much, and thanks for your efforts to try to sort of adjust it. Okay, that's all.
All right, thanks, Woody. Next, we'll go to Kevin.
Kevin, I have enabled your speaking permissions. Do you see the timer on your screen?
I do, yes, thank you.
Perfect. Your time begins now.
Okay, very good. I also won't need anywhere near 3 minutes. I want to take the opportunity when the Climate Action Subcommittee meets to continue to promote having a sustainability director in our city and an implementation team for our climate action plan, and for a staff member to be a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I think those are all things that would be great for the Climate Action Subcommittee to push for. And also, we talk about the fact that we can't effectively address the climate crisis unless we're effectively addressing social justice and equity. And I'm just wondering if there's a way that the Climate Action Subcommittee could really promote Santa Rosa and helping implement programs that support these communities of color and low income relative to climate change and environmentally sustainable practices. So those are my thoughts, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to voice them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Mark.
Mark, I have enabled your speaking permissions. Do you see the timer on your screen?
I sure do. Thank you.
Perfect. Your time begins now.
Alrighty. Yeah, nice new timer too. So appreciate that. Very visual. Yeah, just a couple quick things, and in keeping with the trend, I won't talk too long. Really appreciated the minutes that we had for that were published for the meeting a while back, and just hoping that we can continue getting regular minutes. I know it's yet another thing for staff, and I really appreciate how they're doing that. The other thing was, no, actually, I think that's about it. I do echo the ideas that Woody brought up about the whole Earth Day activity, and I understand that it's a little tricky to put something together, but other jurisdictions are doing that. And I also agree with what Kevin said about joining the Urban Sustainability Network. And I lost my train of thought, should have written it down. So I'm going to put my hand down, and thanks a bunch.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. I'm seeing no other hands. Council members, we did have a late correspondence that was added to the agenda, also on the same issue with the Earth Day. So if you get a chance, make sure you read through that from Eris. And with that, we'll move on to item number 5. That's our discussion items, starting with 5.1, our RCPA Sonoma Climate Mobilization Strategy. How's it going, Suzanne?
Great.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. My name is Suzanne Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Transportation Authority, and for purposes of today, the Regional Climate Protection Authority, our sister agency. We have 3 items, I think, to talk with you about today, and Tanya is going to kick it off.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Mayor Rogers, Vice Mayor Rogers, and Councilmember Alvarez. Really appreciate your interest in this topic. So today, I would like to just give an overview of our mobilization strategy and kind of where we're at and what our current next steps are. So next slide, please. There we go. So I'll give a little bit of background on the strategy, talk about our 2030 goal, and then give you an overview of the individual strategies within the overall framework, talk briefly about RCPA's role and our next steps. So next slide, please. So the mobilization strategy was adopted by the RCPA board on March 8th, 2021. And it's a strategy that we've been working on over the last year with a lot of involvement from community members, organizations, staff members from the different member jurisdictions for the RCPA. So we got quite a bit of input and participation in the process and came up with the overall strategy, which, as I said, was adopted in March. And so on this slide, you see our overall goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2030, which is a stretch goal. I will acknowledge that right up front, but we believe it is very important based on the climate science and the crisis that we face. In terms of the guiding principles, I won't read through all of these, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight for you is that we really attempted to integrate equity both into the guiding principles as well as the entire strategy document. This is an area that's very important to our board. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from our board as well as community members on the importance of equity. And we also recognize that there's much more work to be done as we move forward to implement the strategy, but just wanted to call that out in terms of our guiding principles. The other thing that I'll note is that we attempted in our strategy to focus very much on high impact strategies. So we did not include all of the different actions that are possible and necessary to address climate change and resilience and adaptation, but really focused on those strategies that we felt local government was able to control and to have an impact on, and really focus on those initial strategies. So that's some of the framework or background for the strategy itself. So with that, I'll go on to the next slide. So here is a one potential model for getting to the 2030 carbon neutral goal. And what this shows here is our different sectors of emissions. And you can see, and I know this is well known across the county in terms of the percentage of our emissions that comes from transportation. It is our largest producer of emissions in the county, followed by building energy, and then ag, so fertilizer and livestock, water and wastewater, and solid waste. And so for achieving our 2030 goal, we have assumed an 80% reduction across the board in the different sectors. And then to get fully to zero, we have to assume or achieve an amount of carbon sequestration. So we don't, based on what we know now and the solutions that we see in front of us, we don't see us getting to zero emissions by 2030. And so that requires us to implement sequestration practices to pull that remaining CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so that's that green bar that you see there. And lastly, I'll just note that as you look through the strategy, you may notice that we don't have specific reduction strategies focused on the ag sector other than the sequestration goals. But we do intend, as we're working with the ag sector on sequestration, to also look for opportunities to reduce emissions in that ag sector. So next slide, please. So here is an overall layout of the different strategies that we have, and we've organized them into 4 initiative areas: decarbonization, or basically stopping the burning of fossil fuels; sequestration and ecosystem services, which is that green bar that I showed in the previous slide; resilience and adaptation, recognizing that we are facing today and have faced over the last number of years the impacts of the climate crisis in terms of wildfires, drought, flooding, et cetera. And so resilience and adaptation will continue to be an important area for us to focus on. And then finally, equity and community engagement we see as really being foundational and fundamental to all of the other strategies. And so we have a number of objectives in this area. So I'll run through them just briefly before going on to the priority areas for the near future. So under decarbonization, we have the building energy area or sector, and there's two main strategies there. One is all electric buildings campaign, and the second is carbon-free electricity. So in all electric buildings, by that we mean both existing buildings, so doing energy retrofits to make them more energy efficient, and then converting those gas-powered appliances to electric. And that is a huge challenge we face given the number of existing buildings that we have both on the residential and commercial side. And then for new construction, which kudos to the city of Santa Rosa for adopting the all electric ordinance that you have done. And that is something that we would like to see happen across the county so that our new construction is all electric going forward. And then carbon-free electricity is really continuing the good work that Sonoma Clean Power has already done and accomplished in Sonoma County in terms of cleaning up our energy supply. So encouraging more customers to move to evergreen as well as businesses, and continuing to look for more renewable sources of electricity, working with our partners in Sonoma Clean Power. On the transportation side, we have three main strategies. The Drive Less Sonoma County campaign is all about reducing our driving and implementing alternatives to driving. So things like transit, more bike and ped access. EV Access for All is accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles in Sonoma County, making sure that we have charging stations accessible to everyone who needs access to them, and really looking for ways to make that access more equitable. We recognize that currently, up to this point, EVs have been more accessible for those with the means to purchase them. So we really want to look at ways to broaden the accessibility of those electric vehicles, as well as looking for other solutions. So for example, the e-bike program that Sonoma Clean Power is piloting, the incentive program, and looking at other smaller modes of electric mobility that might be more accessible to a broader set of our community. And then the Vehicle Miles Travel Bank is a more policy or technical solution that we are just beginning to explore as a way of funding many of these transportation improvements that we have in our strategy. And then solid waste, zero waste by 2030. I think the strategy says it all, and I know that's something that the city of Santa Rosa is really pursuing. Under sequestration and ecosystem services, we have three main strategies: protecting existing carbon stock, so protecting what we've already stored in terms of CO2 in our plants and soils, and then increasing the sequestration of carbon, again, in plants and soils, using our working and natural lands, applying practices like no-till farming, applying compost, and planting techniques like adding hedgerows that have been shown to increase the sequestration of carbon in those landscapes, as well as working with our city partners on urban greening projects, tree planting, ways to bring more greenery into the city. And then finally, scaling up the infrastructure for sequestration, really recognizing that we need a lot of infrastructure to support these efforts, from the workforce that can implement the practices to things like nursery plants and compost and all of those supplies that will support those strategies. And then moving on to resilience and adaptation, we have two strategies. One is looking at the energy grid for the future, recognizing the impact of PSPS events and other threats to our energy or electricity grid. And so working with Sonoma Clean Power and others to strengthen that, and looking at solutions like microgrids, for example. And then Climate Resilient Sonoma County is really taking the many reports and plans that have been developed to date and continuing to implement those and move those forward. And we did just finish, well, not finish, but had a major milestone in one of the kind of projects or objectives underneath here, which was the Urban Land Institute just conducted a panel here in Sonoma County over the last week and presented their findings related to increasing our wildfire and energy grid resilience. And so we expect a report to come out from the Urban Land Institute in about 3 months, and we'll certainly share the recording from today's presentation and the PowerPoint slides on our website if you weren't able to join us this morning. And then finally, equity and community engagement. These are strategies designed to more equitably engage our entire community and also work with our local jurisdictions to integrate equity and climate into all of our policies. So now I'd like to move on to the next slide, please, which talks about where we're focusing initially, we being the RCPA. So we presented the strategy to our board and they adopted it along with direction to staff on areas that RCPA staff will be focusing on in the near future. So in the rest of 2021, 2022, we are a small and mighty team, and we need to focus our efforts on those areas that we think we can have some traction on or make progress in the near term. This doesn't mean that all the other strategies aren't important and that we don't want our members and partners to be working on them, but just that these are the areas that RCPA will be initially focusing on. So in the Drive Less Sonoma County campaign, our board has been working with local transit providers to look at the future of transit and put together a set of recommendations and plans to strengthen our local transit system. And so we want to work with and support that effort to improve our transit system. And then in the EV Access for All partnership, we want to continue the work that we've been doing over the last number of years with Sonoma Clean Power to continue to implement public and workplace charging stations, looking for ways to, for example, implement more of those charging stations in our rental housing stock and other places that may not have them today. Also want to support the use of e-bikes and other lightweight EVs, and then create a more accessible and affordable EV assistance service, which would be, for example, having a way to more easily share and communicate the rebates and the incentive programs that are available to lower income residents to actually purchase a used or a new EV. And so looking for ways to make that whole process easier. Under the increased carbon stocks strategy, we want to work with our local ag producers and the regional resource conservation districts who are already working in this area to scale up the carbon sequestration and carbon farm plans, which is a tool that's used to plan the changes that will be implemented to increase sequestration. Under the engaging the community, we are working with our board on increasing the diversity of representation on our Climate Action Advisory Committee, which is a very important advisory committee to our board and to the RCPA. We want to begin developing a more strategic engagement and education campaign, and then really partnering with our local community-based organizations to support the campaign, because we know they have the connections and the relationships in the community that RCPA doesn't currently have. And then finally, on the equity and climate and all policies, we want to take a look at national models of equity impact assessments that have been implemented in other places like Seattle and a number of other cities, and then implement those equity impact assessment processes and tools, and then work with our local jurisdictions to develop a checklist that would support the integration of equity and climate in all of the policies. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of our role, so RCPA is really here to act as a coordination hub and to help align the efforts of our members and partners to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, to look for best practices across our jurisdictions and help develop, for example, model policies that could be implemented by other cities that have not yet taken on those actions. So an example of that would be some early work we did around the REACH codes and working with our local jurisdictions to move forward on developing all electric ordinances. And we work closely with the city of Santa Rosa, for example, on its ordinance. The mobilization strategy is really our framework to help have these conversations with our local jurisdictions and community-based organizations, again, to make sure that we're leveraging efforts across the region. And then probably most importantly, and one of our big challenges currently, is identifying and securing the funding that will be needed to support all of these very important efforts. And so we're looking at ways that we could help bring more of that funding to Sonoma County. So next slide, please. This is my last slide. So in terms of next steps, we're currently working on implementation plans for the priority strategies and researching funding sources, starting to look into that, and beginning our work on community outreach and engagement. And really in that effort, working to figure out how we can more effectively center equity in the work that we do, certainly partnering with community-based organizations, as I mentioned earlier, and other ways that the RCPA can more effectively integrate equity into our work. And then you can see out 2022 and beyond, it's really all about implementing the plan, monitoring. We want to implement some indicators so that we can track our progress. And I'll say a bit more about that when I talk about the inventory in the next section. And so really using that to gauge our progress and to adjust our plans going forward. We really see this strategy as a living document, and we know that we are going to learn as we move forward. And so we really want to not have it be a plan on a shelf, but something that we continually revisit and evaluate how it's working and evolve and change it. So that concludes my presentation on the mobilization strategy, and I welcome your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. And before I go to questions from the council members, Amy and I had a discussion not too long ago about what the intent of this subcommittee was going to be, or how to start prioritizing which action items we wanted to work our way through. So Amy, if you could just, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, what type of information or what type of comments from council members and from the public would best help you and the rest of staff sort of help us to chart this path forward?
Sure. I think maybe focusing on some of the specific areas that our CPA will be focusing on implementing first. Comments there so we can see how we can collaborate and which city staff would be most appropriate to take initiative on those various efforts. So I think maybe, yeah, I know there were quite a few and we don't have that slide up anymore, but specific comments on what the subcommittee is most interested in us exploring, and then we can come up with a work plan internally and see how it aligns with existing efforts as well.
Okay, great. And maybe what we can do too when we come back for comments is perhaps we can get Tanya to share that slide again. I have it down as slide number 6, which will have all of the priorities that our CPA is looking at. Before we go there, Councilmember Alvarez, Vice Mayor, do you have any questions for Tanya or for Amy?
First of all, I want to thank Tanya for the relentless effort to really bring us to that zero carbon footprint. For as long as I can remember, I've always appreciated her efforts on the cab. I don't forget, and it's good to see you, Tanya. In regards to what I would want to see us focus, it's definitely going to be on the transportation, on the driving side. And the reason that I say so is comparing the 1990s to the 2018, I noticed that half that chart is still transportation, regardless of the 20 years that have transpired. So I definitely see that as a point of interest and of concern as well. In regards to the Earth Day and the comments that we heard from the public, I think it's something that we do need to speak on, that we are sending the wrong message, especially when half of those numbers seem to be transportation. Thank you.
Okay, Vice Mayor?
I don't have any questions. I do appreciate the presentation. I appreciate all the hard work. I love that we're trying to incorporate some diversity and reaching more communities, because I believe that the more people that we reach, the faster it will be to get to our, to our desired what we want. And so I just thank you very much.
Great. And Tanya, I think my question for you, and I think you've heard this from a couple of other folks as well, just in the various presentations that you've given, have you had a chance, or is there a possibility for RCPA to really go through and help us to quantify how to start eating this elephant, right? Which, if we put, with our limited dollars, if we put it all towards accomplishing one thing, what's going to give us the best bang for our buck in terms of our carbon reductions, our greenhouse gas reductions?
So the analysis that we've done to date has really been from our inventory. And so, that's where we really look to transportation as one of the big pieces of where we need to direct our attention. And specifically in terms of, swapping out our fossil fuel powered automobile fleet and light vehicle and heavy duty vehicle fleet with electric vehicles, recognizing that that doesn't solve the whole puzzle and that it is still very important to reduce driving as well. But that's, part of the reason for really continuing to focus on that EV piece as well as the transit. So looking at those alternatives that are needed to help make it possible to reduce driving in Sonoma County. I also want to acknowledge there is much more analysis that could be done and probably should be done in some of these areas. For example, as we start, at the point where we start working on the building energy piece, starting to assess in more detail the existing building stock and starting to identify how do we start tackling that huge challenge of retrofitting those buildings. And I know that there's more data analysis we'll want and need to do in that regard, but we have not started that process yet. So
yeah, I can appreciate that. And I think that RCPA and SCTA is the perfect nexus, particularly for our transportation networks. And Suzanne, if you want to, feel free to jump in and offer some comments here on some of the work that SCTA is doing in collaboration, if that's helpful.
Sure, happy to. And Councilmember Alvarez is absolutely right. Transportation is it's kind of the toughest nut to crack, but it's also the most important one in a lot of ways because it is the biggest piece in our community. So we've done a number of things on the transportation side to date that I'll just run through a few of those quickly, and then there's plenty more that we need to do going forward. About 3 or 4 years ago, we adopted what we called Shift Sonoma County, which was a low carbon transportation action plan. And it focused on fuel shift and mode shift. So how do we get people to quit driving guzzling cars and make EVs both affordable and accessible and charging reliable? And then how can we provide alternatives to driving? So how do we get that mode shift into transit, onto bikes, new creative approaches? And so we've done some pilot programs through trying to implement that plan. And we've tried car share in Sonoma County, and it didn't take off as much as we would have liked. And I think it was a little premature. It was a good learning lesson though, because as Santa Rosa in particular starts focusing on downtown development, I think car share will actually be much more effective and will be able to thrive. And we didn't quite have that density and attract enough folks with our pilot program, but that was a good lesson. We have a guaranteed ride home program that we operate. So if people take transit and end up having to get home for an emergency or to pick up a child or something like that, they are guaranteed a free ride home. We also have bike share as part of our shift plan, and bike share is going to roll out later this year. We are working with your staff and all of the cities that are currently along the Smart Rail corridor to develop a bike share program. And in addition to all that, there's transit. And Mayor Rogers serves as the chair of our Future of Transit Ad Hoc Committee. And that group meets monthly, has been meeting monthly for the last, 4 or 5 months now, talking about how we use sort of the crisis that was the pandemic and how horrible that was for our transit users and transit operators. How do we come out of that stronger and bring new people back to transit, bring people back to transit and new people to transit? So we are working with our regional partners at MTC about on that effort, as well as with our 3 local bus operators, as well as Smart and Golden Gate Transit. So there are, having said all of that, there's also this issue of housing and land use planning and the work that the city's doing around downtown development and new housing, around Smart, around transit stops, really plays into that planning and implementation that gets us to get people to not drive for every trip they need to take. So I hope that was helpful, Mayor Rogers.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. And actually, started my day this morning watching a webinar that SCTA and RCPA helped put together with the Urban Land Institute to look at some of those, call them policy decisions on where we place people and how to better integrate our transit network into it. So I know that that'll be available as well. I also just want to highlight how difficult it can be for people to do mode shift if they don't have safe bike lanes. And I know that that's something that I would be interested in helping us to prioritize. Other types of transit only matter if people feel safe or willing to use it. And I think my last question before I turn it over to the public really is looking at the carbon sequestration side of this. There's a lot of balls that are in the air on transportation, on building. What I don't hear much of is the carbon sequestration side, and in particular, urban carbon sequestration, and what types of policies or practices or incentives we can be putting into place in Santa Rosa to really help further that conversation. I don't know if either of you have any suggestions on how to approach that.
So I know that there are other cities that are working on this. So we certainly could, connect you or put you in touch with those cities. And there's a network that's working on urban greening specifically, or urban carbon gardening, for example. And so we've initially chosen to focus on the ag side simply because there is some existing effort going on there, and our resource conservation districts, for example, are working closely with ag producers on that topic. But yes, we could definitely find some additional resources that we could share with Santa Rosa to look at that urban piece, because definitely lots of opportunities there. What hasn't been done so far that we can determine is a quantification of how much sequestration is possible within a city's boundaries. And so that's also something that we'll want to look into further.
Great, thank you. So I see one hand up so far. If you're interested in giving public comment on this item, go ahead, hit the raise hand feature on Zoom. We'll start with Mark.
Mark, I have enabled your speaking permissions.
Terrific, thank you.
Your time begins now.
Yeah, I forgot to say where I live and all that. So Mark Mortensen, Santa Rosa in the West End neighborhood, as Ms. Mayor Rogers knows. Just wanted to say thanks again to Tanya and our CPA staff for the great work on the SCMS, the mobilization strategies. I would encourage the city to be the first to adopt it. Give it a good home and let's start working with our CPA to identify priorities. And I guess this kind of tags on with a later comment. They've already identified some good priorities. And so I agree with Amy Nicholson that perhaps seeing if the city priorities and those priorities that our CPA has identified might align. So that they can, we can have more people working on specific strategies. And there are a lot of strategies. I can just imagine, new council members to the Climate Action Subcommittee looking at all of these different things. I mean, it's a lot to take in for even those of us who immerse themselves in the climate crisis. Fortunately, the next step is the implementation plan, which our CPA is going to be working out. I would encourage Tanya to take a look at the County of San Diego's implementation plan, and I'll send her a link on that one. It is very detailed and it gets right down into the personnel required and number of personnel and so on. Let's see, specific actions and ordinances are what need to happen next. No surprise there, along with obviously identifying funding. I would recommend also connecting the dots with the the Urban Land Institute presentation and their recommendations. Connect those dots with the mobilization strategy put out by our CPA. Find the common threads and one of the priorities that was identified by our CPA is collaborating with community-based organizations. And there's a lot that needs to happen, and we're out here and we're ready to collaborate, ready to help, supporting in whatever we can do, research and looking for other jurisdictions that have implemented specific actions. We know of these, and we have a lot of good resources out here. For instance, on the sequestration side, I know of at least a couple different tools that will calculate sequestration, carbon sequestration for specific species of trees. And so there is information out there for helping out on urban sequestration, which also includes obviously carbon gardening, we have some ideas on that too. So happy to support and really appreciate the amount of work that has to happen here, and we want to help out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Are there any other hands on this item? All right, I'm not seeing any. Do we have any voicemail public comments?
We do not.
Okay, great. I'll bring it back to the council members then. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention our partnerships with Sonoma Clean Power, which I think are pretty critical, particularly on the electrification side. So I do want to give them a quick shout out. And then I'll also tell the council members in our League of Cities Environmental Quality Committee meeting last week, we had 50 council members who were on it. And the warm-up question was to talk about ways that you were funding your climate actions in your community. And it was basically crickets. So I do think that that's a critical component and an important conversation topic for us is how are we going to bring in funding to the scale that we need to meet the goals that we have and quite frankly, the science that we see. So that's my 2 cents. Any additional thoughts, either Eddie or Natalie?
For me, it is about education in our communities, and I think Natalie might have touched on that a little bit ago. And it's right. It's a loud cricket. So there's a lot of lack of education on the subject, and I know that a lot of organizations have come into the neighborhood to try to educate folks. And now, as a councilman, I really want to be involved into those efforts. And so I guess I'm reaching out to folks to give me a call and definitely include me into those talks. Like again, there's been a disconnect, and I know it's not because of lack of effort. It's just maybe the way that's being received. So hopefully I can actually help influence that.
Anything, Vice Mayor?
No, I feel the same way that Eddie feels definitely about getting involved. And Mark, I believe, yes, this is something that we need to do by, diversifying. And I don't know all the terms and things because this is all new for me. Although it's not for a lack of not wanting to be involved and learn. And I think as I progress on the council and on these boards, I will be able to contribute in a different way. So it definitely is an educational experience, but I am ready for the ride and to have others in my community get on the roller coaster too, so they can see what's going on and how they can contribute also.
All right, so I'll see if there's an interest from the subcommittee in recommending that the city sign off on the climate mobilization strategy and adopt its principles. I'm seeing a thumbs up motion from Councilmember Alvarez and a thumbs up second from the Vice Mayor. I don't know if we have to formally call a vote to be able to do that, but let's do it just in case, Callie.
Councilmember Alvarez,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Rogers,
Aye.
Mayor Rogers.
Aye.
Let the record show that all council members are in agreement.
Perfect. Do you need any other direction, Amy?
That was really helpful. And I think what we can do is work together and then come back to the subcommittee with some ideas and present it so that you all can hear it and members of the public can as well.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. And then with that, we'll move on to item 5.2. It's the overview of our greenhouse gas inventory.
All right. And I think there should be a slide deck for this as well. Yeah. All right. It's on its way. Awesome. So you can go to the next slide, please, Kaylee. All right, so wanted to give just a little bit of background on our greenhouse gas inventory and kind of conclude my remarks with some thoughts around additional indicators that that RCPA is thinking about, and I would welcome Santa Rosa's feedback on. So first, just a little bit of background for the inventories that we produced. We produced our first countywide inventory as part of the Climate Action 2020 and Beyond plan that was released in 2016. And in that plan, we shared a baseline inventory for 1990 and a 2010 greenhouse gas inventory. And that was all data that was used to inform that planning process. And then the RCPA published an inventory update for 2015 data in 2018 and for 2018 data in 2020. And then we're planning our next inventory, which will cover the year 2020 in 2022. So you should hear a theme there, which is that it takes some time to produce the inventories. We're not able to, for example, report today on 2020 emissions, even though 2020 is past. And we have some anecdotal information, but we won't actually be able to publish that official full inventory until sometime in 2022. And I'll say a bit more about the reasons for that as I go forward. But that is one of the limitations of using only GHG data to track our progress. So we do use a standard protocol for the inventory, which is the US Community Protocol. We've used the same methodology for all of our inventories, so you can be assured that when we're comparing year-over-year data, we're using the same methodology. It's an activity-based inventory, which means that it measures the emissions that are under local government control, and they're from activities that happen within our county boundary. So the amount of fuel that's burned, water used, waste disposed. But I would also add for the waste disposal piece, we are including emissions. We're tracking the waste that we produce here in the county, regardless of where it's ultimately landfilled. So we are counting for those emissions that are from waste buried outside of the county, as well as that transportation emissions that are used to truck that waste out of the county. It's a community-wide inventory, which means that your Santa Rosa municipal data is part of the numbers that we're reporting. And we're not currently at least reporting Santa Rosa's municipal emissions separate from the community as a whole. We are able to report, and we do report both countywide and by jurisdiction, and we can provide the data for Santa Rosa to you, on request if you want to use that for planning purposes. And so in this slide here, you see the sectors that we're currently tracking with the inventory. We already talked about transportation being such a high percentage, and you can see the percentages of the other sectors. In the transportation sector, we are now including smart emissions because those were happening in 2018 for the first time, but we don't include airline emissions. And we are hearing a fair amount of community interest in starting to track and report more information about air travel and how that impacts our emissions. But just to be clear that those emissions from the planes themselves are not included in the inventory. Certainly the airport ground operations, the energy used at the airport terminal, and the airport ground support vehicles are all part of the inventory, but not the actual flying part of it. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this slide is one that was shared as part of our last inventory update, and it just shows you how we're doing relative to the 2020 goal that was set out in the previous climate action plan. And I think I have another slide that shows how far we need to get to reach that 2030 goal, the new 2030 goal. And then this chart on the right just gives you a sense for how emissions have changed over time. And not surprisingly, in the building sector, you see that we have made excellent progress, and really the majority of that we would attribute to Sonoma Clean Power and to cleaning up our electricity supply. Unfortunately, we don't have kind of low-hanging fruit options like that in the other sectors, which just means it's going to be harder to reduce emissions in other sectors, as Suzanne mentioned, related to transportation, for example. So we can go to the next slide, please. So here's the slide that shows the previous target and trajectory that we were on with the 2020 plan, which had us reaching the 80% below mark by 2050. And as I mentioned earlier, that's been pulled up now to 2030. So you can just get a sense for the steepness of that curve and how much we need to reduce to actually achieve that goal. So next slide, please. So I want to take just a minute to give a little background in terms of how we calculate emissions, kind of what goes into those calculations. And it's a fairly simple calculation, if you will, but it can get quite complex depending on the data that we're working with. But based on the protocol that we use for the inventory, at its simplest level, the emissions are calculated by taking some type of activity data and multiplying that by an emissions factor. So looking at on-road transportation, for example, the activity data that we used is from our Sonoma County travel model that SCTA maintains, as well as data from the California Highway Performance Monitoring System that tracks overall vehicle miles traveled across the state. And then the emissions factors for that transportation come from a model that's maintained by the California Air Resources Board called the MFAC model. And this basically uses data from the DMV that gives the mix of vehicles that are registered in Sonoma County. And it has data in terms of how much those vehicles pollute. And we use that data combined with the vehicle miles traveled to calculate an estimate of our on-road transportation emissions. And then building energy is a little bit more straightforward. It's basically our electricity and our gas usage from the utilities, so from Sonoma Clean Power and PG&E, and then using emissions factors that come for electricity from the climate registry and a model called eGrid. And these are verified emission factors. And this is one of the things that causes a delay in us reporting our greenhouse gas emissions, which is that verification process takes some time. And so for the last inventory, for the 2018 inventory, for example, we didn't have those verified emission factors for electricity until I think it was early in 2020. And so that held up the final calculations for our inventory. So again, just a little bit of background in terms of how we're actually calculating those emissions. And so we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk just briefly about another inventory methodology, which is known as a consumption-based inventory. And this slide shows you our sector-based or activity-based emissions inventory on the left-hand side, which for 2015 was about 3.4 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. And then the consumption-based emissions inventory, which really looks at the results or the emissions generated by our consumption patterns. So the kind of food that we buy and the goods that we purchase and the services that we use and the travel. So it would include things like airline travel, for example. And so you can see that those emissions calculated using that methodology are higher than our activity-based emissions. And you can't just add the two types of inventories together to get a total because there is some overlap. So for example, the fuel that's used within the county would be included in both the consumption-based and the activity-based inventory. But this is a type of inventory that we're hearing more interest, again, from the community in starting to report, in part because it does give you a different picture in terms of the impact that our consumption patterns have. So if we go to the next slide, which has a little bit more detail about what is in that consumption-based inventory. And this is an inventory that was calculated by a group out of UC Berkeley, and they used 2015 data. So I don't have a more recent consumption-based inventory, but that is something that we might want to consider doing in the future, just to see how, if and how our patterns have changed. But you can again see a similar pattern here in that our transportation emissions are a significant portion of the overall footprint, if you will. This does include the air travel piece. And then you can see from our other sectors, like our foods, the types of foods that we eat and the impact they have, the services that we use, our buildings, which when we measure emissions in our activity-based, we really look at the fuels that are burned, so the electricity and the natural gas that are used to power those buildings. But there are other components that contribute to the emissions from buildings, the construction materials used, the waste that's generated, et cetera. So that just gives you a picture of what would be within a consumption-based view of emissions. So let's go to the next slide, please, which I think is my last one. So I mentioned at the beginning that we are interested in looking at other ways of tracking our progress on the mobilization strategy. And given that we're not able to measure our GHG emissions as as timely a way as we would like, we're looking at other indicators of progress. And so certainly we could look at some of those activity metrics. So our electricity and gas usage, we're able to get that on a much more, not real-time basis, but at least, I could access the data for 2020, probably right now, actually, by reaching out to the utilities. So we could look at, how is our electricity and gas usage changing over time? Same thing with water usage, solid waste tonnage, we have that available to us. Other metrics like transit ridership, gasoline and diesel sales, we can get some of that information. Looking at our electric vehicle sales, which we'll definitely want to look at these as part of our EV Access for All partnership to see how we're doing in terms of increasing the adoption of those vehicles. Can we track the number of energy retrofits that are completed? And I'm sure there's many other types of indicators that we could consider tracking, and really want to think about what are the most important indicators or measures of success that would be really helpful in tracking whether we're making progress or not. So I will stop there and ask if you have any questions or comments.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Just a quick question. How are natural disasters like the fires accounted for in our inventory?
So and this came up as a question in our 2018 inventory. So for wildfires, for example, we're not capturing the emissions from the actual wildfires themselves, although there has been an attempt at the state level to estimate emissions from wildfires. And in fact, there's a draft of a report that's out, I believe, for public comment in terms of measuring those emissions, but we don't include that in our inventory. And then in terms of the solid waste, the materials that were burned that were landfilled, it turns out they're basically inert. And so other than transportation costs and transportation emissions from moving that material out of the county or to the landfills, once that material, like the ash, is in the landfills, it's not actually producing additional emissions. So we were able to take some of that into account, but certainly there's more emissions from wildfires that we're not currently able to track and report on.
Okay. Questions from council members?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. In regards to the car sales, could you elaborate what car sales incentives you've seen and what you would like to what you envision as an effective car sales for the electric vehicles, please?
Sure. So Sonoma Clean Power for a number of years had an incentive program where it was actually an off the top, I don't know if rebate is probably not the right word, but it was an incentive. So if you purchased an electric vehicle through one of the local dealers, they would, basically give you a certain amount off of that vehicle purchase. So it helped with the cost of the vehicle, but certainly didn't bring it down, far enough to be affordable to everyone. There are other programs that are being developed that would provide more of a not necessarily, we want to look for programs that aren't rebate programs where you have to put out money up front and then apply to get money back, which is how some of the state level programs have operated. So more of an upfront type of incentive is something that we'd be interested in to make them more accessible. And would certainly welcome your thoughts as well.
Well, with the federal change, the federal administration change that we've just experienced, do you see anything coming from them in regards to rebates or any type of incentives?
There is some legislation in progress, and I'd be happy to share the details of that with you that would look at incentives, tax credits for EVs, extending existing tax credits for EVs, and then looking at ways to make make EVs more accessible to low-income purchasers. So yes, definitely with the change at the federal level, we are expecting to see a lot more support for climate action across all the sectors.
I would appreciate knowing what they have coming down the pike.
Yeah, I can definitely share that with you.
Changes. Thank you, Tanya.
I think I'm kind of struggling with low income. What exactly is low income? When we look at housing, I know that there's a matrix for low income, but when we look at the middle income brackets too, there's also people that may not be able to go out and afford to replace a vehicle. So that is something that I would want to look at a little bit more is what exactly is low income and how can we find a program that broadens that a little bit for middle class working families that want to make this transition. As we get out and educate more people, we might have more of a desire for people to say, hey, I would like to replace my vehicle, but they're not high income, so they can't necessarily just go out and do that. So I just did want to bring that point up.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Alvarez.
Thank you once again, Mayor. In regards to charging stations, what incentives do we currently offer the business community, and are there any changes there at the federal level that you have seen?
Yeah, I believe that there will be changes at the federal level or additional programs and incentives that would support that. There's been a program that Sonoma Clean Power has been leading called Cal EVIP that provides funding for local businesses and other property owners to install charging stations on their properties. And that program actually, I think, is fully subscribed because it was very popular. And actually, that program had a focus on getting more EV chargers out into our rural communities, because that's an area where we have a need that hasn't been fulfilled yet. So, and that's the kind of program we want to look at, finding additional funding to support more of that.
Okay, we'll go and we'll see if there's any public comment on this item. We'll start with Mark, followed by Kevin.
Mark, I have enabled your speaking permissions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, as far as the EV program goes, yeah, I benefited from that Sonoma Clean Power program. As a teacher, I don't have a huge income, but I do have an EV, and part of the reason I have it is because of that plan from Sonoma Clean Power. I would say also about EVs is that they are becoming more affordable, especially now that we're getting leased EVs being returned. People are turning in lease cars. And so, for instance, to get a Nissan Leaf, it's not a great range on it, but it's $99 a month, $1,000 down. And it's not exactly the high priced item that, that they used to be. Of course, none of us are going out and getting a Tesla right now, but so EVs. That being said, there's a lot of talk about EVs as like a big solution on this, but there are embedded greenhouse gas emissions with electric vehicles. And so really, I like to keep my EV parked and take my bike out more and take the buses more, but they don't make those connections and they don't run with the frequency. And so, we keep hearing the word transportation coming up throughout the meeting today. I really think that, we've identified that biggest bang for the buck already, and that, actions around, getting complete streets that are bike friendly and pedestrian friendly, and transit that's affordable, frequent, and goes to where we need to go, though that could be the first place to look. Steve Bertelbaugh and the Sonoma County Transportation and Land Use Coalition and some of the folks on that group have a lot of great ideas on policy that would to incentivize people to use transit and bike paths and such, and also to disincentivize the use of those autos as much as possible. A lot of the trips are really short, especially in Santa Rosa. So great opportunity for if we just had safer bike paths that connected things. And I know we'll be talking more about that coming up. I really appreciate the fact that consumption-based emissions is being tracked. And I put a note here about Portland, Oregon being a case study for this, but I also saw a link on Tanya's presentation about C40 being one of the links. So I think she probably already knows about that one. So I guess the moral of the story here is transportation, making it affordable. Thanks a bunch.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. Kevin?
Kevin, I have enabled your speaking permissions.
Okay, thank you very much. With regard to tracking emissions, and I apologize if this is already happening, but I think there can be a lot done and an easy way to determine how many gallons of gas are sold in either a city or in our county. And then I would like to see RCPA not only track those, but actually set some goals and timetables for reducing that number. Also, with regard to EVs, I think it'd be great to educate the public about especially in this area where we have the PSPS problem, about the vehicle to home technology. In other words, in the event of a PSPS, there's technology that will allow people to use their electric car battery to actually power their home. And I think and those batteries are actually hold more than I understand they do than even the Tesla Powerwall does. So I think if more people realize some of the benefits beyond just cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions, but some of the other benefits of having an electric vehicle, maybe it might help promote sales. And then lastly, and I wanted to bring this up and didn't hit the raise my hand button soon enough, but when we talked about urban gardening, carbon gardening, I just wanted to mention the fact that we do have this Southeast Greenway campaign strip of land running down our city, especially between Farmers Lane and Summerfield Road, where there is just land sitting there, baking out there in the sun, and I understand from the Southeast Greenway people, from Thea and others, that they would not have any objection to steps taken by our city to actually add some amendments to that land and begin to utilize that land for carbon farming, carbon gardening, community gardens that are carbon based. So just to throw that out there, that it's an incredible resource for capturing carbon, sequestering carbon, and I'd like to see some creative thinking about how that can be done, since the Greenway campaign right now is in kind of a stalled posture, and would have no objection to that kind of effort being made. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I'll go ahead and bring it back. Do we have any voicemail public comments?
We do not.
Great. Any last thoughts from the different council members? All right, thank you, Tanya. We'll go ahead and go on to item 5.3. I think this is Suzanne, right?
Yep, it is. And we've got some slides here as well.
Bringing it up right now. My computer's moving a little slow this afternoon.
Thank you, Kelly.
I feel it.
Oh, dang. All right. So the item today was to check in with you about our local sales tax measures that are dedicated to transportation and how that links with efforts related to climate change. So just a quick history. The Sonoma County Transportation Authority led an effort back in 2004 to put a quarter-cent sales tax measure on the ballot. It was known as Measure M, and it was successfully passed by just over 2/3 of the voters of Sonoma County, and it had a 20-year time frame. So as we were getting, we're believe it or not, we're getting close to the end of that 20-year life, and the SCTA board started discussions back in 2018 about when and how to approach a reauthorization of that quarter-cent sales tax. The initial measure was very prescribed, and it was very focused on certain projects. So for example, 40% of the measure was dedicated to Highway 101 improvements. 10% went to bus operators, 5% went to passenger rail, to SMART, 20% for local road rehabilitation, 10% went to, or 4% went to bike and pedestrian projects that were listed out explicitly in the measure, and the same 20% went for roadway projects that were listed out explicitly in the measure. Part of the theory there was we needed to tell voters what we were going to spend their money on, and then generate sort of a track record of delivering on the promises made to voters. So in 2018 and 2019, the board wanted to advance a new measure, acknowledging that we had been very successful with our current measure, that we had leveraged that local money significantly to deliver important transportation projects, but also that we we had a need to shift, that we didn't need 40% for Highway 101 anymore. We needed funds for other types of projects. SMART has its own sales tax measure now, so maybe we don't need 5% dedicated to them. So the board put together what we've called the Go Sonoma Act, and that's what voters, 71% of them supported it in November. And now we're in this kind of transition zone, which is that orange piece on the slide there, where we will be winding down Measure M over the next few years, and then Go Sonoma actually goes into effect in April of 2025. So between now and then, we will be ramping up efforts to identify what those key projects will be for early delivery in Go Sonoma. So the next slide, please. The Go Sonoma expenditure plan is different, significantly different from our initial sales tax measure, not only because of things like Highway 101, as I mentioned, but also because we took a different approach where we are less explicit about exactly which projects will get funded, and we'll have more of a competitive approach for certain categories. So we divided the measure into 10 different buckets. 38% is going to be directly allocated to public works departments like the city of Santa Rosa on a formula basis for smooth and maintained roads. This is about double what was committed in Measure M for pothole repair and local road maintenance. 27% of the money is going to go towards a program that we are calling Move Traffic and Improve Safety. And this is meant to address multimodal approaches for infrastructure projects. So it could be a road diet, for example, or it could be an improvement along Mendocino Avenue where you need bus turnouts and restriping for bike lanes. So that's going to be a competitive program that has criteria spelled out in the sales tax measures, but not specific projects. 23% of the measure is dedicated towards bus service. Again, more than double of what was previously committed from local funds for bus transit. So that's an exciting opportunity to work with our bus operators in Sonoma County to help grow service and look at creative approaches to getting people to take more transit. And then the last category is build bikeways and pathways. I mentioned Measure M had 4% dedicated to bike and pedestrian pathways explicitly. We've tripled that in this new measure so that 12% will go just towards bikeways and pathways. And this could be for bike and pedestrian safety, this could be infrastructure projects, but it also could be programmatic. We do have a Safe Routes to School program in Sonoma County, but it's not in every school, and it's very popular. So we have opportunity perhaps to grow that program as well. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about these. The Move Traffic and Improve Safety program is really, this is the one that I think we're going to have the most opportunity in the next couple of years to start talking about and engaging with our jurisdictions on what they aspire to deliver with these funds. And I think there's a very clear climate nexus. They may be infrastructure projects, they may have roadway components, but they are meant to be complete streets that can help with infill development projects, for example, or could even help with evacuation route planning. So this category, I think, is kind of the most intriguing and provides the most sort of innovative opportunities. Next program, or next slide. I mentioned the additional money for bus service. It's a direct subvention to each of the bus operators, but it's also an opportunity to do some innovative work around what we call transportation demand management. I mentioned earlier the Free Ride Home program, but there's also carpooling opportunities or new technologies that can be deployed to match people up with rides. And as we come out of the pandemic and people are starting to feel more comfortable being around each other, and vaccines are more prevalent, we have a really great opportunity with our new measure to explore different technologies and approaches to maximize the number of people in vehicles. So buses are great, and how can we look at van pools and carpooling programs as well? Next slide, please. And then lastly, just to reiterate the bikeways and pathways component, we are super excited for the opportunity to deliver on bike infrastructure. The Measure M program that funded bike and pedestrian projects was the most successful in terms of delivery, along with Highway 101. Those are the two programs where we hit it out of the park. And so sort of rewarding that by saying we should triple the amount that goes to bike and ped. So that's an exciting opportunity as well. And as part of that, I should note, we at the SCTA manage, we develop and manage our countywide bicycle and pedestrian program. And so we work with all of the cities and the county on a bike plan. City of Santa Rosa has a great bike plan that we were served on your technical advisory committee and we're very engaged with. But we're going to update our bike plan. It hasn't been updated in a number of years. So we're excited about the opportunity to do that work, that planning work over the next couple of years and have it teed up for the new sales tax revenue money when it becomes available. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the bike plan is one of the things coming up next. We also will be adopting our long-range countywide transportation plan later this year. I mentioned earlier the transit collaboration, and we're talking about how we have a unified brand so that for users of bus transit, they can't tell the difference between buses. They just get on a bus and they know it's going to take them somewhere in Sonoma County. So that's an exciting thing as well. And the impetus for doing a local tax measure is obviously to fund local projects, but it's also to leverage state and federal funds. And we and our partners have been very successful in taking that local money, getting projects ready to go, and then seeking outside grants at the state and federal and even regional levels to deliver sort of more projects. In the Highway 101 corridor, we were successful at a rate of 5 to 1. So for every $1 we had of local money, we brought in $5 additional of outside money. Some of our bike ped projects had similar success. Some of our other projects did as well. And so we're excited to know that we've got another 20 years of local sales tax money that we can leverage, especially in this era right now, frankly, with a new administration. Infrastructure planning and funding is very real at the federal level. And the state has sort of changed up the way they do transportation funding as of a few years ago. And so there are new opportunities there as well. And I think that concludes my presentation. Could you go to the next slide? Yep. So I'd be happy to take questions.
All right. Council members, any questions?
I don't have any questions. A few notes that I took down were that I really appreciate the fare free program for students. I know for a long time we've had fare free for JC students, and me having high school students that like to go to the mall and go here and go there, and it's not really a bikeable, so then I have to drop them off, or even my children commute down to Petaluma for school. And it's really hard to get public transportation that coincide with the scheduling to get them there at a decent hour. And so that has been a problem. So I'm driving back and forth to Petaluma. As far as safety is concerned, I think that in the bike lanes, that is very important to me. And I think that not only do we need to make the roadways safe, but we also need to have make sure that we have adequate patrol, because there is a lot that people in cars are doing that I'm seeing more and more that don't make it safe. So even if we build it and it's there for people to utilize, people may not feel safe too because of the people that are continuing to be on our roadways, that are running stoplights and stop signs, that are not vigilant. They're on their phones when they're driving. I mean, things like that. So I think we probably need to have some collaboration with how we're going to address that for people's peace of mind, not just having the infrastructure.
Could I comment, Mr. Mayor?
course.
Thank you for bringing up Fare Free. I should have said something about that because we did actually carve out a piece of the transit funding to dedicate to the Fare Free program. It's really been very successful in multiple jurisdictions, especially with students. So totally appreciate that comment. And the safety and enforcement issue, especially around bikes, is critical. People aren't going to ride bikes if they don't feel safe. And so making that infrastructure not just feel safe, but be safe as well is a high priority.
And Suzanne, do you have, I know that there was a quantification at some point about what the cost would be to do all transit completely fare free in the county. Do you remember what that number was?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was, I want to say it was between 3 and 4 million. Is that low? It might be low. It could have been just one of the options. I'm sorry. I can find that and get it back.
Yeah, sorry. I don't mean to put you on the spot just as we're talking about the fare free transit. I remember we did look at it to see if in this measure we wanted to just make all transit free. And I remember it crowded out everything else that we needed to do as well.
Maybe it was 11 million. And that's why it was not.
That's sounding a little bit more likely.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was 11 million.
Okay. So, Councilmember Alvarez, any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. I did have comments though, if that's okay. I really do appreciate that the projects are requiring to have. Actually, that's actually my question. Currently, do we require the projects to include the bike and pedestrian elements, or is this something that okay, it is? All right, I'm very happy with that.
Well, so the way our current measure was written is they had to consider bike and pedestrian elements in roadway projects, but the language in our new measure is even stronger.
Okay,
so,
perfect.
Yeah.
And can we fix Barham Avenue, please? There's your question. Thank you.
Sure.
All right.
All right, Amy, anything to add? Okay, we'll go to public comment on this item and see if anybody is interested in providing any. Mark, I see your hand up first.
Mark, I have enabled your speaking permissions.
Alrighty, thanks again. Yeah, really appreciate the work done on this, and the folks over at SCTA in getting the measure to go through, and we all worked hard on that one. We like the greater numbers. Climate activists are happy about. Well, we'll never be happy. There's never enough for transit and bike paths, and always too much for roads, it seems like. But a couple quick comments. We have transit ridership, has been measured and on commutes. And at one point it was measured to be 2% of commuters, or 2% of the commute trips were taken by transit. And that number actually went down. And so I appreciate that we've got money in Measure M to try and increase that. But I really do think that looking at reducing fares and educating, apparently fare box receipts are not such a large part of the funding for transit, from what I've heard. And so perhaps a program that educates community members about the cost of driving, what is it, 55 cents a mile or something for reimbursements on miles traveled versus the cost of bus travel. You look at that over a year and the numbers come out pretty positive for taking a bus if you've got regular service, convenient, and it goes to where you need it to go. And a comment on bike paths. Obviously, all bike paths are not created equal, and so there's some. The cheapest route is painting green sections of the road and calling it a bike path, and that's not those paint does not keep people safe. And so separated bike paths will be an essential part of the solution here in transportation. The City of Santa Rosa's Bike and Pedestrian Master Plan update has a goal number 2. It says maintain and expand the network. identify and develop and maintain a complete and convenient bicycle and pedestrian network. Well, I was out there today, and you know, it's you got to go off the paths quite frequently. So, and they're mostly just stripes on a road or paint. So having more connections for people to actually safely take those trips would really help. The jurisdictions provided project ideas for Go Sonoma for the initial work done on it. Each jurisdiction provided some ideas. I suggest maybe taking a look at those again and connecting them with the priorities that we've been talking about with our CPA. Thanks a bunch.
All right, thanks, Mark. And did we have any voicemail public comments?
We did not.
Okay, I'll bring it back. And Mark brought up an interesting little wrinkle that I'll just mention, which was fare box recovery. So we actually are required under state law to have a certain amount of fare box recovery or a certain percentage of fare box recovery. And actually the funding for Measure DD can be applied towards that formula, as even if people aren't actually paying it as fares, it's still the public's money that is supporting the public transit, which is what actually allows us to do some of our fare-free rider programs. So I thought I would just mention that. Any additional comments from the subcommittee?
I have a comment, but it's not about this, so.
Okay, we'll come to you in just a minute then.
Thank you.
Just a quick thank you to Tanya and Suzanne for your time today to come and really help us to get our sea legs as we try to look at what we're going to do next here in Santa Rosa to really continue to push the envelope around climate to hit our climate action goals. And obviously RCPA and SCTA are going to be huge partners for us in that over the next 20 years as you help fund many of the things that we would like to do. So thank you for being here. Any last words?
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Right.
Thank you.
And that was just an informational item. So we'll move on now to subcommittee reports. I think I heard the vice mayor say she had something she wanted to comment on.
Yes, and likewise, I would like to thank Suzanne and Tanya for coming. I enjoyed all the information, and I look forward to us working collaboratively to see what we can implement and make happen in our city, in our county also. As far as I wanted to comment on Earth Day, Chris, Mayor, sorry. I wasn't quite sure when is the appropriate time to do so. So as some people have mentioned, we did try to see what we can change about Earth Day. And what I was informed that the plans were made when we were more in COVID and our tier was not the same. And so we're gonna keep it the way that it is. But in honor of everyone that has brought it to our attention, I am going to bike to Earth Day because I am not going through the line, and I will be out of my vehicle anyway to greet the beautiful faces that will be coming through. So I am going to bike just in honor of that it is Earth Day, and I do realize that it probably would have been a better tribute to our Mother Earth if we did bike. So I am going to do that. So that is my pledge to everyone, that I'm going to get out and utilize my bike, which I love doing anyway. So thank you guys for bringing that to our attention.
I appreciate that as well. Vice Mayor, I will race you on our bikes.
I love a little competition.
All right, AB, do we have any staff announcements or staff comments?
I just wanted to thank Suzanne and Tanya for their presentations today. It was great of them to take the time and share all of that information with us, and we certainly look forward to continuing to work with you on our various efforts.
Great, thank you. That was our last item. So with that, we are adjourned for today. Thank you, everybody.